This audio fanfic is rated K, which is the same as a movie rating of G for general audiences. This is intended for all ages. For more information on what the ratings mean, please go to www.esrb.com.
Changes by TrudiRose. Disclaimer: Disney owns these characters. I don't. Author's note: the novel Precious Bane was published in 1924. I realize that this means Belle could not be reading it in the 1700s, but it seemed appropriate, so please forgive the anachronism. Belle slipped into her bedroom and closed the door with a sigh of relief. She was glad to be back in her quiet room and away from the frantic, bustling activity that permeated every corner of the castle. The last week had been such a whirlwind of emotions for her. First, the romantic dance with the beast in the ballroom, then seeing her dear father sick and lost in the woods, the beast unexpectedly letting her go, nursing her father back to health, only to face the threat of him being committed to an insane asylum, the villagers storming the castle, and that horrible, endless moment when she thought her beast was dead and lost to her forever. And then the shock of seeing him not merely alive, but transformed into a prince. He had scarcely had time to tell her of the spell he had been under, before Cogsworth had whisked him away.
"There's no time for talking, sire. There's much to be done."
Messengers had been dispatched to inform the prince's uncle, who had been acting as king in his absence, of the prince's return, and to invite him and all the royal court to a celebratory ball 3 days later. The castle was buzzing with activity as the newly human servants polished every surface, prepared a banquet, decorated for the ball, and made elaborate arrangements for the wedding the following week. The prince was so busy with Cogsworth, relearning all the royal etiquette he needed to know, and catching up on 10 years of politics he had missed, that Belle had hardly seen him since the transformation. Belle herself had been taken over by Madame la Grande Bouche, the former wardrobe, who kept her busy with measurements and fittings for her wedding dress.
"This will be the most beautiful wedding the kingdom has ever seen,"
Madame la Grande Bouche promised. Her wedding, Belle sighed. Everything was happening so fast. The king was arriving today, the big celebration and ball was tonight, and her wedding was scheduled for next week. She felt so confused. All her life she had loved fairy tales. Now she was living one, but it wasn't what she had expected. It was so hard to wrap her mind around the idea that this handsome prince was really her beast. The fact that she had hardly seen him at all in the past 3 days didn't help. And yet, next week she was to marry this man, this prince, who looked like a stranger to her. As always when she was unsettled, Belle took refuge in books. She had slipped unnoticed to the library, found a volume by an author she'd heard of but hadn't read, and escaped to her room. She was glad that her room, at least, was relatively untouched by the transformation. The rest of the castle had become unrecognizable, changing from a dark, gloomy ruin full of cobwebs and gargoyles to a shining silver palace. Now sunlight streamed through airy rooms, revealing vases of flowers, colorful rugs, graceful draperies, and statues of angels and cherubs. It was much pleasanter, Belle had to admit, but the immensity of the change was dizzying. Her room, however, was mostly the same, aside from the fact that the wardrobe was gone. It had been a pretty feminine room before, and it remained so. The walls were still the same shade of lavender pink, the rug was still blue with a gold border, and the canopy bed still wore its rich, wine-colored draperies. Its familiarity was comforting to Belle. She settled on the bed and opened the book, Precious Bane by Mary Wells. She began to read. The protagonist, Prue Sarn, was a girl who had been born with a hare lip. She was a good and kind person, but the villagers shunned her because of her deformity. She was certain that no one would ever love her, because no one could see past her ugly appearance. Belle sighed and closed the book. It was well written, but the theme hit too close to home. Belle wanted an escape from recent events, not a reminder of them. There was a knock at the door. Belle looked up.
"Come in,"
she called. The door opened, and he was there, her prince. It was still such a shock seeing those familiar blue eyes looking at her from a human face. His shoulder-length, wavy, light brown hair was tied back neatly. He wore a ruffled white silk shirt, royal blue velvet trousers with gold trim, and black boots that had been polished till they gleamed. He looked like a prince, Belle thought. No one would ever imagine that just a short time before he had been a ferocious-looking beast, all bristling fur and razor-sharp fangs and deadly claws.
"I hope I'm not disturbing you,"
he said, coming toward her.
No, not at all,"
said Belle, putting the book aside. He looked at her, this incredible girl who had transformed his life. She was wearing her simple blue dress with a white apron, her hair in a loose ponytail. She was so beautiful. He had never known he could care about someone so much, or feel so devastated at the thought of losing her. For the umpteenth time he considered holding his tongue. It would be so easy. Their wedding was only a week away. Then she would be his forever. He could just keep quiet. But no, he knew he had to do this, even if it meant losing her. He owed her that much.
"Belle, I need to talk to you,"
he said seriously.
"Of course,"
said Belle, wondering what was going on. He ran his hand over his hair, a gesture she recognized from before. He often did that when he was at a loss for words. He sat down on the end of the bed.
"Belle,"
he said finally.
"you know our wedding is scheduled for next week."
"I know,"
she said, watching him closely. He took a deep breath.
"I want you to know that—"
He hesitated, then took the plunge.
"You don't have to marry me if you don't want to."
Belle was startled. She didn't know what to say.
"What's going on?"
she asked.
Did they tell you that you have to marry a princess?"
"What? Oh, no, it's not that,"
he said.
"Then you don't want to marry me?"
she asked. He looked shocked.
"Oh, no, Belle."
He took her hands in his.
"You mean everything to me."
He saw her confusion and sighed.
"Belle, you have to understand."
He stood up and began pacing, searching for the right words.
"The night the enchantress cursed me was the worst night of my life. You can't begin to imagine how it felt. It was like living in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. When I was a child, I sometimes dreamed that a monster was chasing me. I'm sure you've had that dream."
She nodded.
"But now I was the monster. I couldn't hide from myself. I couldn't escape what I was."
He stopped pacing. He was looking straight ahead, but not seeing the room. His blue eyes were full of remembered pain.
"I destroyed all the mirrors in the castle, except the enchanted one. I couldn't bear to see the hideous creature I had become, but I saw it in the eyes of my servants, the horror on their faces when they looked at me, the way they trembled and hid when I raised my voice. They were never afraid of me before. And the rose,"
he went on, a trace of anger creeping into his voice.
"that accursed rose! It mocked me with what I could never have. I often wish the enchantress had not put in that escape clause, that false hope to torment me. I could break the spell and get my life back, if I could get someone to love me. It was a cruel joke. No one could ever love such a monster."
He trailed off into silence, remembering. Belle couldn't bear to see that haunted look in his eyes. She went to him and squeezed his hand reassuringly.
"But someone did love you,"
she reminded him, wanting to draw him back from that dark place. It worked. He turned quickly, his eyes focusing on her, and smiled.
"Yes,"
he said.
"Someone did love me, and I changed back to myself. I finally had what I wanted for so long."
His smile faded. He looked troubled.
"But, Belle, it wasn't what you wanted. You didn't know about the curse. You never asked for this. You fell in love with the beast, exactly as he was. And as soon as you did, he was gone. And now there's just me. And maybe that's not what you want.
Belle flushed guiltily. She had had some fears along those lines these past few days, though she had tried to ignore them.
I hated myself for being a monster,
he said softly.
I prayed for an end to it. But you, Belle, you loved that monster, and I took him away from you.
Abruptly he turned away from her, not meeting her eyes.
I once forced you to promise you would stay with me forever,
he said quietly.
That was wrong and selfish. I swore to myself that I would never do that to you again. So?
He closed his eyes briefly.
If you don't want to marry me, I understand. It's all right. You can go back home to the village. You don't owe me anything.